All right, guys. Morning. We're gonna go through World War II. This is SOL number 12. Okay. And let's start with talking about these guys up here on this picture. These guys over here we talked about last week, along with this guy. Okay, so you have Benito Mussolini, who was fascist Italy; Adolf Hitler, who was Nazi Germany; Hideki Tojo, who was the military leader of Japan. Okay. These were the Axis powers. Okay. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union; Winston Churchill, who was the leader of the United Kingdom a little after the war started, and we'll talk about that in a second. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the leader of the United States. So with the causes of World War II, there were many economic and political causes that led towards the war. There were major theaters of war in Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Usually Europe and the Pacific are the two main ones we talk about. There was aggression by totalitarian powers. This was Germany, Italy, and Japan. There was nationalism. There was the failure of the Treaty of Versailles, a weakness of the League of Nations, appeasement, and tendencies towards isolationism and pacifism in Europe and the United States. So right here in this picture, you can see the isolation. You have Uncle Sam in this bed, and this is the rest of Europe. And you see Stalin itch, Hitleritis, Blitzpox, Nazi fever, fascist fever, and Italian mumps. And it's symbolizing Europe going through all this stuff going on, and the Americans just over here minding their own business. Hitler and Mussolini both appealed to the feelings of nationalism to gain support from people in their country. Okay, as you can see right here, you have hundreds of thousands of soldiers lined up to hear Hitler speak. And I want to show you a video clip real quick that is very symbolic of this. So 1 second, let me get that video up. Okay, so I could not get it to load up on YouTube and to record it that way. So I pulled it up on my phone and I'm going to spin it around so you can see it. This comes from Star Wars: The Force Awakens. And just look at the imagery of the stormtroopers.
The end of a regime that acquiesces to disorder. At this very moment, in a system far from here, the new republic lies to the galaxy, while secretly supporting the treachery of the loathsome resistance. This fierce machine which you have built, upon which we stand, will bring an end to the Senate, to their cherished fleet. All remaining systems will bow to the First Order, and will remember this as the last day of the Republic.
So as you saw in that, as General Hux is giving his speech, he gets louder and more angry as he's talking. That's the same way Hitler gave his speeches. The symbolism, the colors of the Empire, the First Order, and Star Wars were made by George Lucas to symbolize the Nazis and how it is. And I have an entire presentation showing how you can compare the Nazis and World War II to Star Wars. So I might do that one day this week. We'll see. But because all the soldiers here, it would either be tan or black uniforms. You have the red of the banners, the white of the circle, and the black of the swastikas. With the failure of the Treaty of Versailles, it was considered a very harsh peace by the Germans, from the amount of reparations they had to pay to what was going on. And the new government put in place under the treaty was very unpopular, and this created a situation where Adolf Hitler was able to gain support. League of Nations was very weak. Like we talked about last week, they had no teeth, had no power to enforce decisions. I guess it was 2 weeks ago. But anyway, look at the picture here. The bunny's dead. Okay, the bunny's not going to make it. The snake's going to eat him. That's what happens. Okay, with appeasement, it was a policy of satisfying demands of an unsatisfied party in hopes of keeping peace. Okay, the West didn't want another war. By the West, I mean England and France. The Americans were out of it. The, they were willing to appease Hitler to keep him from causing another war. The main guy that caused this was British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Okay, he allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland, which was an area of Czechoslovakia. And then once they reached this agreement, and Hitler promises, I promise I'll go no further than what's controlled by Germans. Chamberlain goes back to Britain, holds up a newspaper that says, "Peace in our time." He was so proud of himself. And then Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. So, didn't work. This ended up starting the downfall of Chamberlain, which occurs shortly after the fall of France. Shortly before the fall of France. Chamberlain's voted out of office, and Winston Churchill's put in place. Major events of the war. You have the German invasion of Poland, fall of France, Battle of Britain, German invasion of the Soviet Union, Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, D-Day, the atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, we're going to go through each of these pretty quickly. So the German invasion of Poland was beginning of World War II. It was September 1st, 1939. What happens here is it's called Blitzkrieg. Okay, it's a lightning war. And Hitler sends across small groups of Germans into Polish territory to take the radio towers along that border. So when the center of Poland radios out, what's going on? Is everything okay? The Germans replied, everything's fine. Thing was, these small groups of Germans, they had one guy who could speak Polish fluently, perfectly. So that when they replied, everything was okay. They replied in Polish as part of the misinformation campaign. The fall of France, France surrendered on June 22nd, 1940. This left Germany in control of Western and Central Europe. German-occupied France was known as Vichy France. Now, when they take France, the Allies flee up here to Dunkirk, which was a small city on the coast of France. They were trapped. And thousands of regular people, fishermen, people who own yachts, things like that, sailed across the English Channel in face of death to evacuate the soldiers. This was known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. There was a movie about it a few years ago. It's a really cool story. The Battle of Britain, this was August 1940 to June 1941. Hitler wanted to invade Britain, but knew he had to weaken him first, so he started bombing the country. This proved to be a failure. This was Hitler's first major failure. Winston Churchill was the prime minister, and he was seen in the bombed streets of London every single day, checking on the people, kind of bringing their morale back up, saying, we can do this. If we can hold out, we can do this. After the failure in Britain, Hitler turned around and attacked the Soviet Union. This was in direct violation of a non-aggression pact that the Nazis and Soviets signed in August of 1939. Hitler wanted access to the raw materials of the Soviet Union, and he makes a key mistake. The Nazis had a beeline for Moscow, the Soviet capital. Could have taken it. Then Hitler orders them all to turn and attack a small industrial city in the southern Soviet Union for no other reason than ego. The city's name was Stalingrad. Hitler knew that Joseph Stalin had a huge ego. He named the city after him. And Hitler thought that if he took this city, it would break the back of the Soviets because he took something named after Stalin. What he didn't count on was Stalin sending the entire Soviet military to Stalingrad. What ends up happening is a long siege where hundreds of thousands of civilians are killed. But it's a devastating defeat for the Germans. They have to turn tail and retreat, with the Soviet Red Army nipping at their heels the entire way. Up to this point, the United States stayed out of the war. We had sent some goods, sent some boats and weapons and things like that, but we'd stay out of the war itself until December 7th, 1941. In an effort to stop the Japanese aggression in the Pacific, the U.S. cut off the sale of war materials, iron, steel, oil, things like that, to the Japanese. In turn, the Japanese have a sneak attack and they attack Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, which was a date which will live in infamy, as U.S. President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, put it. Next day, we declare a war on Japan. Germany declares war on us, and we are wholeheartedly into World War II. Okay. Skipping ahead a bit, like I said, this is not all the battles. This is just the major stuff that's in your SOL. You have D-Day. This is June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. This opened up a second front in Europe. What happened is, to make this work, they had to use some mind tactics. Okay, they had to be smart about it. So prior to this, I believe it was 42, 43, General George S. Patton, who was one of the main World War I generals, got pulled from the field because he slapped a soldier who had shell shock. And shell shock is basically PTSD. He slapped the soldier thinking he was just weak and couldn't fight. FDR pulled pulled Patton out of the field. So when he does that, Hitler's like, no way, no way, no way. No way they pulled Patton for slapping a soldier. And we use that to our advantage with D-Day. FDR puts Patton back in the field, puts him in charge of the 1st U.S. Army Group. Huge army. Couple 100,000 men, 1,000 tanks, 1,000 planes. Huge army. And they start building up a base to invade France at Pas de Calais. Okay? The Germans see this, and they send all their defenses to Calais. What the Germans don't know is it was Patton and maybe about 1,000 men. The tanks were inflatables. The planes were plywood. The couple 100,000 men were just empty tents with lanterns lit in them. It was the best disinformation campaign of the war. And it worked perfectly. Hitler sent all his defenses to Calais even after we had hit Normandy and we had a foothold and we were pushing through France. Hitler believed that Normandy was the distraction for the invasion of Calais, not the other way around. So in 1944, France was free by the end of August. By April of 1945, the British and the American soldiers met in Berlin, and the war in Europe came to an end on May 8th, 1945. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the American general in charge of D-Day. He was the supreme Allied commander in Europe. With Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. What just happened? Hang on 1 second, guys. Okay. No idea what that was. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan continued to fight on. Okay. We issued an ultimatum. We said, stop. Stop fighting, surrender. We had two choices. We could invade Japan, which would lose 1 million people, or we could drop the bomb. At this point, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died. Okay, he had a stroke and died in April of 45. His vice president, Harry Truman, became president. So Truman had two options. He could lose 1 million people. He could drop the atomic bomb. He went with the atomic bomb. And on August 6th, the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. We told the Japanese, surrender. Japanese refused. So 3 days later, we dropped another bomb on Nagasaki. Then the Japanese surrendered. September 2nd, 1945. And this was Victory in Japan Day, the end of World War II. Major leaders. You have FDR, who was U.S. president during most of the war. Truman became president after the death of Roosevelt. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the leader of D-Day. Douglas MacArthur was the U.S. general in the Pacific. Okay, the way you remember that is the capital A in the middle of his name. He was in Asia. George Marshall was Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army and architect of the European Recovery Program, also known as the Marshall Plan. We already went over these guys, so we're not going to hit them again. Elements leading to the Holocaust, you have genocide, which is a systematic and purposeful destruction of a racial, political, religious, or cultural group. You have totalitarianism combined with nationalism. You have the history of anti-Semitism. You have the defeat in World War I and economic depression blamed on European Jews. You have Hitler's belief in the master race. And then you have Hitler's final solution, which was the extermination camps, gas chambers, things like that. That's what when you hear Auschwitz or Dachau, these different camps. It was part of the final solution. Outcomes of the war. You have a loss of empires by European powers. You have two superpowers in the world now, the Americans and the Soviets. You have the Nuremberg trials or war crime trials. You have the division of Europe, the establishment of the UN, the Marshall Plan, and the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So we're going to go through these rather quickly because I know this video is starting to get long. The war crimes trials, the Nuremberg trials were held in Germany. This was to hold trials for crimes against humanity committed during the war. The Iron Curtain was not a real curtain, okay? It was a metaphor for the division of Europe between East and West, between the Soviet-controlled Europe and the western part of Europe that was like the U.S. and Britain. International organizations, you have the United Nations, which was formed at the Yalta Conference. You have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, that was formed by the U.S. and Western Europe in 1949. The Warsaw Pact, which was a response to NATO, formed by the Soviets in 1955. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, established and adopted by members of the UN. It provided a code of conduct for the treatment of people under the protection of their government. To reconstruct Germany, you have the Marshall Plan, which was the recovery program. The democratic government was installed in West Germany and West Berlin because Germany was divided between the Allied powers. Britain, France, and the Americans controlled West Germany, West Berlin. Soviets controlled East Germany, East Berlin. West Germany became an economic power. In Japan, the U.S. occupied Japan under MacArthur. There's democracy and economic development. Japan agrees to give away their offensive military capabilities as long as the U.S. guarantees Japan's security, and Japan becomes a dominant economy. Other genocides, I don't know why this chart got messed up, so we're going to move on. The Armenians, they were killed by the Ottoman government. Okay, it went from 2 million in 1915 to, by 1923, the entire Armenian population of Turkey was gone. Okay, the Ottomans killed all the Armenians. With Pol Pot, he was the leader of Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. He wanted to make a communist peasant farming society, so he killed 25% of the country's population through starvation, overwork, executions. These were the killing fields of Cambodia. And then in Rwanda, this was literally like just under 30 years ago. Hutu extremists within the political elite blamed the entire Tutsi minority for the country's problems. And on April 6th, 1994, the president of Rwanda died. Okay, his plane was shot down. He was a Hutu. They blamed the Tutsi. And in response, 800,000 men, women, and children who were Tutsi were killed. Okay? The only difference between the Hutus and Tutsi, when I think it was Belgium left Rwanda, it was a Belgian colony, and they left. They put the Tutsis in charge because the Tutsis were a little taller, and their noses were a little thinner. Okay, that was the only difference. Because they looked slightly more European, the Europeans left them in charge. The Hutus didn't like this, and in turn, it led eventually to the Rwandan genocide. There's a book on this called Machete Season. I read during college. It's a hard read because it's heartbreaking, but it really shows the Rwandan genocide very well. There's also a movie called Hotel Rwanda that shows this very well as well. So that is all of the notes. If you have any questions, concerns, anything like that, let me know. Um, and I will go through this and take questions during the Google Meet. So if you have any questions, let me know, and I will talk to you guys later.